Raghav, Mira, and Kunal, three names tied together by blood and marriage, but also by secrets, envy, and betrayal. Behind the closed doors of their family home, a crime unfolded that no neighbor could have imagined. A wife brutally murdered, a brother consumed by jealousy, and a family willing to deceive the world with a carefully staged lie. What began as a story of love and respect soon spiraled into one of deception and destruction, proving that sometimes the darkest dangers live not outside, but within the walls of our own homes. The Sharma family lived in a two-story house in a quiet town, where life moved slowly and neighbors often knew more about each other than they admitted. To outsiders, the family looked stable and respected. Raghav, the elder son, was a schoolteacher who carried himself with a calm authority. His wife Mira was the heart of the household, admired for her kindness and her habit of helping others without expecting anything in return. She managed the home with care, ensured meals were served on time, and even found time to tutor neighborhood children in the evenings. Raghav's parents felt fortunate to have such a daughter-in-law, and often praised her to relatives, yet within the same home, another life unfolded in silence. Kunal, the younger brother, had grown restless with his position in the family. Unlike Raghav, he had no steady job and no clear direction. He picked up temporary work when it came, but most days were spent wandering aimlessly or sitting alone. His parents often excused his lack of ambition, thinking he would eventually settle down, but they did not see the bitterness growing inside him. Kunal felt as though he lived in the shadow of his brother's achievements and Mira's grace. No matter what he did, it seemed small compared to them. At first, this frustration showed itself in small ways. He avoided family conversations, skipped meals at the table, and spent more time away from home. But gradually, it transformed into something heavier. He could not stand the way Mira commanded respect, the way his parents listened to her, and the way neighbors praised her character. In his mind, she represented everything he did not have: admiration, influence, and importance. His resentment deepened when he noticed that his brother never seemed to struggle, while he faced constant failure. Mira herself never suspected the storm brewing in Kunal's mind. She treated him with courtesy, offered help when he needed it, and sometimes encouraged him to find stable work. To her, he was simply her husband's younger brother, someone who would eventually discover his place in the world. But for Kunal, these gestures felt like reminders of his inadequacy. Each word of advice felt like a judgment, and every act of kindness felt like pity. The more she smiled, the more he despised her. Time moved on, but Kunal's feelings hardened. Nights were spent replaying bitter thoughts, imagining a life where he no longer felt invisible. The resentment turned into obsession. He began to think of Mira not as family, but as the obstacle standing in the way of his place in the household. It was not sudden rage but a slow poison, seeping into his mind until it shaped every thought. His parents noticed only his quietness, his brother was too busy with work to see the signs. Beneath the peaceful surface of the Sharma household, a dangerous secret was forming, waiting for the moment when envy would break into violence. That summer night carried with it a heavy stillness, the kind that makes every sound echo louder than usual. The day had passed without incident. Dinner had been served in the usual fashion, with Raghav speaking about his work at school and Mira gently reminding him about errands he had promised to run. Their parents retired to their room early, as they often did in the heat, leaving the rest of the house in quiet darkness. Kunal remained awake long after the others had gone to bed. He sat in the dim light of the living room, his mind replaying the same bitter thoughts that had plagued him for months. Each second seemed to push him closer to the point of no return. The silence of the house should have been calming, but to Kunal it only amplified the storm inside his head. His resentment toward Mira had grown unbearable. Every moment he had spent comparing himself to his brother, every look of approval their parents gave to her, every word of admiration spoken by neighbors, it all burned in his mind. That night, he convinced himself that ending her life would finally free him from the invisible chains that bound him. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, as though afraid the very walls would catch him in the act. In the kitchen, he found the iron rod that had long been kept to support an old water tank. Its cold weight sat heavily in his hands. His breathing grew shallow as he gripped it tighter, feeling both fear and determination clash within him. For a moment, he hesitated, but the image of Mira's face, always calm, always respected, flashed in his mind. The bitterness inside him demanded action. Step by step, he moved toward her room, his bare feet pressing softly against the floor. The hum of the ceiling fan inside her room was faint but steady, a sound that seemed almost to mock the silence of his approach. When he entered, the room was dim, lit only by the moonlight slipping in through the curtains. Mira slept peacefully, unaware of the danger standing beside her. Kunal's hands trembled as he raised the rod. His heart pounded so hard that it seemed it might give him away. Then, in one swift and brutal motion, he brought the weapon down. The sound was a sickening thud that seemed louder than anything he had ever heard. Mira barely stirred before her life slipped away, the violence ending her peace in an instant. For a moment, Kunal froze. The rod slipped slightly in his grip as he stared at what he had done. The stillness of her body, the silence that followed, and the finality of it all crashed down on him. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. Panic surged, but he forced himself to breathe, to steady his hands. He knew he could not wake the others, not now. He placed the rod down and stepped back, his mind racing. Every sound of the night, the ticking of the clock, the distant barking of a stray dog, felt like an accusation. He whispered nothing, but his silence was louder than screams. In that moment, he realized he had not just taken a life, he had bound his own to a lie that would consume everyone in the house. The morning light crept slowly into the Sharma household, but instead of routine sounds of tea boiling in the kitchen and voices stirring in the courtyard, the house filled with a piercing scream. Mira's lifeless body was discovered, and in that instant, the fragile illusion of order shattered. Raghav stood frozen, unable to comprehend the sight before him. Their parents rushed in, horrified, yet as shock turned to frantic whispers, a dangerous thought began to take root. They could not allow the truth to emerge. If the police discovered that Kunal was responsible, the entire family's name would be destroyed, their respect in the community lost forever. In their panic, they convinced themselves that protecting Kunal was the only option left. Together, they decided on a story. Mira, they would claim, had been killed during a robbery. It was a common enough tragedy, one that people in the town had heard before, and it offered them an explanation that shifted the blame away from the family. To make the story believable, they needed evidence. Kunal stood silently as his parents and brother moved around the room, staging chaos to fit their lie. Jewelry boxes were opened, their contents spilled carelessly onto the floor. A drawer was pulled out and left hanging, papers scattered around it. The back door was forced open with a tool, the wood splintered crudely to suggest an intruder's entry. They worked with trembling hands, fear of being discovered driving them forward. Some items of little value were tucked away to make it seem like the thief had taken them, while the more expensive possessions were left untouched, hidden in their usual places. To the family, it seemed convincing enough. They rehearsed the story quickly, each one agreeing on what they would say when the police arrived. Mira had gone to bed as usual, they would claim, and sometime in the night, thieves had broken in. She had either tried to resist or been caught unaware, and they had silenced her before fleeing. When the authorities finally entered the house, they found the Sharmas weeping uncontrollably, their grief looking raw and genuine. Raghav clung to his parents, his voice breaking as he told them about the robbery. The sight of Mira's still body added weight to the story, making it difficult at first to question. Neighbors gathered outside, murmuring in shock, repeating the version they had just heard from the family. To them, it was a heartbreaking tragedy but not an unfamiliar one. Robberies in the region had been reported before, and the explanation seemed plausible. The officers took notes, carefully observing the scattered belongings, the broken door, and the family's distress. Outwardly, the scene matched the story being told. But even as statements were recorded and photographs taken, small details began to catch the investigators' eyes. The jewelry on the floor looked suspiciously cheap, almost as if chosen deliberately. The way the drawer had been pulled out seemed unnatural, too staged to resemble the frantic act of a thief. Still, in that moment, nothing could be proven. The family's web of lies held, at least long enough for them to believe they had successfully diverted suspicion. They could not know that the very details they planted would become the cracks that would betray them in the days to come. The first few days of the investigation passed with the robbery story holding firm. Police officers filed their reports, neighbors offered sympathy, and the Sharma family clung to their version of events as though repeating it enough times would make it unshakable truth. But trained eyes rarely accept surface appearances. The lead investigator, a man with years of experience in violent crime, walked through the house several times, each visit revealing something new that did not sit right. The back door, which had been supposedly forced open, bore marks that seemed too shallow, as if the damage had been inflicted deliberately rather than by someone breaking in under pressure. The drawers and cupboards had been disturbed, but the placement of items felt oddly careful, as if designed to appear messy without the urgency of a real search. As the days stretched on, the questions deepened. Why had the thieves chosen to take imitation jewelry while leaving behind the real gold ornaments that any outsider would have snatched first? Why were there no footprints or signs of struggle in the courtyard, despite the family insisting that intruders had entered from there? Even the neighbors, when questioned more thoroughly, admitted they had heard no commotion. Only one woman recalled a loud, singular sound in the middle of the night, a heavy thud that she thought came from somewhere close, but not the flurry of activity expected from robbers rummaging through a house. Attention slowly began shifting back toward the family. Their behavior during questioning raised further suspicion. Raghav recounted the supposed events with a precision that felt too rehearsed, his voice carrying the same details each time as though he had memorized lines. His parents remained consistent as well, perhaps too consistent, their story identical in phrasing, which struck the officers as unnatural. Kunal, however, was different. He grew restless during interviews, shifting in his chair, offering vague answers when asked about where he had been at the time of the crime. He insisted he had been asleep, yet his timeline was unclear, and his inability to meet the investigators' eyes did not go unnoticed. The forensic team's findings added new weight to the growing doubt. The iron rod recovered from the backyard appeared to be the murder weapon. Its surface bore smudges and partial fingerprints that did not match any outsider. When examined closely, they aligned with Kunal's prints. At first, the family tried to explain this away by claiming Kunal had often used the rod to help with household tasks. But the placement of the prints, combined with traces of blood, made the explanation flimsy at best. Behind closed doors, the investigators began piecing together the likelihood that the crime had not been committed by strangers at all. Instead, the evidence suggested an insider. Each crack in the robbery story widened into a gap, and each gap brought the focus back to the Sharmas themselves. The image of grieving relatives began to shift in the eyes of the police into something more sinister, a family working together to shield one of their own. Though the truth was not yet spoken aloud, the walls of deception were closing in, and the fragile lie they had built was beginning to collapse under its own weight. The turning point arrived when the investigators decided to push harder, armed with the evidence that was quietly stacking against the family. The iron rod was their strongest lead. Fingerprint analysis left little room for denial. Kunal's prints were present, not faintly, not partially, but in clear patterns on the very spots where the rod would have been gripped during the attack. The stains of blood, faint but undeniable, tied the object directly to the crime. The police presented these findings during a round of questioning, watching carefully for reactions. The shift in the family's expressions was telling. For the first time since the tragedy, their grief-stricken masks slipped, replaced by a mixture of fear and hesitation. Raghav, who had until then played the role of a devastated husband flawlessly, began to falter. He avoided eye contact with the investigators, his voice breaking not from sorrow but from the strain of holding on to a lie. His parents grew defensive, raising their voices, insisting that the police were trying to frame their family. Kunal, however, sat in silence, his eyes darting from one officer to another, his breathing uneven. The weight of the evidence was too heavy, and the cracks in their story widened into gaping holes. Days later, under continued pressure, Raghav broke first. The guilt of carrying the lie had been gnawing at him, and when faced with the possibility of harsher consequences, he confessed. He admitted that there had never been a robbery, that the story was carefully staged to protect his younger brother. He spoke in fragments, his words spilling out as though a dam had burst. He described the decision to scatter the jewelry, the breaking of the door, and the rehearsed statements they had practiced before calling the police. His confession opened the door the investigators needed. With Raghav's admission, the focus shifted fully to Kunal. Cornered and exposed, he could no longer hide behind silence. At first, he muttered excuses, blaming stress and sleeplessness, but soon the truth emerged. He admitted to killing Mira, his voice shaking as he explained the jealousy and resentment that had festered inside him. It was not money he wanted, not revenge against a wrong done to him, but an end to the constant feeling of being lesser, invisible within his own home. In his mind, Mira embodied everything he lacked: respect, admiration, and importance. Taking her life was his twisted attempt to reclaim control. The revelation shattered what remained of the family's reputation. Neighbors who had once admired them now whispered in disbelief. The idea that such violence could come from within the walls of a respected household sent ripples of shock through the community. For the investigators, the case became a grim reminder that the most convincing lies often come wrapped in tears and tradition, and that the enemy is not always a stranger at the gate but sometimes a brother at the table. Kunal was arrested and charged with murder, while Raghav and his parents faced charges for obstructing justice and misleading the investigation. The verdict closed the case, but the story lingered in the minds of everyone who heard it. A house once seen as honorable was now remembered as a place of betrayal, envy, and a silence that turned deadly. The lesson left behind was chilling: danger does not always break in from the outside, sometimes it grows quietly from within, waiting for the moment it can no longer be contained.